Hello and welcome to MEPcast, a podcast for maternity education program of Clinical Skills Development Service. In each episode, we explore ideas and issues on how we can enhance and improve the delivery of maternity care education.
Thank you for joining us today. Today, Dr. Mia McLanders, human factors expert, and myself will be looking at how to work in a team, how teams work, and how leadership of teams is important. I'd like to welcome my guest today, Anne Parmenter, head field hockey coach at Trinity College, Hartford, USA. Anne is an accomplished outdoor educator with a passion for rock climbing and mountaineering and has climbed a number of international peaks, including Mount Everest in 2006. Anne is an experienced mountain guide, and today Mia and myself are going to discuss with her how teams can affect both performance and how to be a successful team leader. Welcome to the podcast, Anne.
Yeah, you're welcome, sister.
That's great. So preparing for this podcast, I was reading all about teams, and it's been quite interesting because I've worked in teams all my career and obviously have done some leadership roles. But a statement that came out to me was by Henry Ford, really hit home for me as a true reflection of teams, that coming together is a beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is success. And I think that can be true about every team that we look at. And my listeners might be wondering why I'm interviewing somebody who's a hockey coach and a mountaineer and climber. And we had a discussion around this, that really teams and leadership goes across all disciplines. And I felt this would be a great opportunity to just share some of your experiences and talk about some of the experiences and how you've put that into play. So with that said, there's been a lot of successful people around the world who've put together lots and lots of great ideas, but without their great teams, this would not be successful. I think things like Google and Apple are really good examples of that. So, Anne, how would you best describe good teamwork?
I think full disclosure first, I am Sue's sister. And so we have that connection. And I've played on teams all my life, starting when I was about 11 years old. So I've been a member of a team, just a little cog in a big system, and then going on coaching, and then being part of a team when it comes to mountaineering, I think brings out the best and the worst in people. And I think the area that all of you work in medically and in midwifery, very similar to mountaineering, where life and death situations are really putting people under an awful lot of stress, and how people deal in stressful situations, in critical decision-making situations, can either make or break a team. People come together and it's successful, or it falls apart and it's disastrous. And I think it doesn't matter what discipline you're working in. I think we can draw a lot of similarities between those different areas. So, yeah.
Interesting. Can you describe a time when you were in a team that worked really well and why it was so successful?
Yeah, I mean, I've played hockey, obviously, and then I've coached hockey, and I've been fortunate enough to play on some teams that were really successful in England. And the times when they were successful, even though you were doing a physical pursuit, it felt effortless, and it was easy, it was smooth, it didn't feel like work. When I've been coaching, the teams that I've had the most success with, although the student athletes were working incredibly hard, every single pass just was perfect. Again, effortless. It was like watching a really finely choreographed dance rather than something that was just a grunt. And then my return trip to Everest in 2006, people willing to share and help each other made an incredibly difficult physical challenge a little bit more pleasant, because you felt like you had the support of your team, even though it was physically a challenging thing and you're in a stressful environment. My failed attempt in 2004 was just horrendous, and it had a completely different feel in 2006. It's just, when teams work well, it's easy.
And I'd like to just delve a little bit deeper into that concept of effortlessness, because it kind of maps onto what I understand as flow, right? Being in that state of flow. But I'm curious to know how that maps onto something like where you're summiting Everest, or even, I'm aware you run marathons as well, where they're objectively very difficult endeavours. But how do you, when you're in a team and you're seeing it as an effortless pursuit, but how is that possible when you're doing such a physically demanding task?
I mean, I think a lot of people can equate to running. A lot of people run, and there are days where I certainly will run the exact same course, and it will feel, a 10K could feel like a marathon on one day, and then another day it could feel like a 5K, depending where you're at. And it's not even physically; it's almost mentally and emotionally. And sometimes, the being in the zone concept is a little probably similar to what you're talking about, a flow state. There are times where I've just had an amazing run and you didn't realize you've been running for an hour. And there are other times where you run for 20 minutes and it feels absolutely awful. Preparing to do a really difficult rock climb, getting myself mental imagery, deep breath, calming your breathing, being aware of the fact that adrenaline is flowing, but trying to control the senses that you have to put everything completely into the pursuit that's before you. That preparation, that ultimate preparation and leading up to, I'm nervous the day before I know I'm going to go on a really difficult climb, or if it's going to be a race, or I'm coaching against a really great opponent. I get those pre-game butterflies in my tummy. And I've always said the day that I don't have those anymore should be the day I stop coaching and competing, because I think that's what helps to give you that sharper edge in performance. So it's being able to channel all of those things, knowing that you're going to do something that's really difficult.
And so when you're coaching and playing, are there times when you have had experience where there's been really effective teamwork, or really very much that the team being in that flow state, but then the outcome not necessarily reflecting that?
Yeah, and I think with young athletes, there have been times where we've just played incredibly well and up to our potential and even beyond, but accepting the fact that in that situation, the other team was just better than us. And I think being able to, especially with young athletes, get them to own their own performance, be okay with the fact that there are times where you can play your best and still be beaten. And then there are times you can play terribly and you can win. And that's really hard to get your mind around. But that's all part of just human performance, is being able to compartmentalize those different performances and then be able to analyze them. And playing to your best and still not winning, I think, keeps you coming back on the field and pushes you to then perform again the next day. And so those are the challenges I set to my team. Yes, we can feel like we played really well, but don't accept a great performance either, because there's always more.
So how does that map onto the clinical environment, do you think?
I was just thinking about asking you the question of, this is great in this situation, like you were saying about pre-match butterflies, but some days we go into work and you don't know what you're going to face. So I'm also thinking about how you prepare people in the clinical space to be able to manage that. And Amir and I have discussed this in the past, and when we did our human factors discussion, that whole managing your adrenaline, managing your emotions is quite difficult. And I think as a younger clinician, and you talk about your young athletes, that in the beginning is very difficult when it's a very emotive situation, certainly in the midwifery space, and I think in the general nursing space as well, where you have ill patients. But I certainly can see there's comparisons here. I think what you're saying, Anne, is training and practice is what makes the team come together, if I'm reading that correctly. Would you agree?
I always, we used to say practice makes perfect, but in fact, perfect practice makes perfect. And there's a difference. Every day, and here in the US, the way sports is structured, we practice every single day, and then our games are on a Saturday or a Sunday. every single day demanding perfection in practice. Otherwise, what's the point of practicing it if it's not up to game intensity at the same level as the game? You're just going through the motions. And for me to put my head in the same space that you are, we do a lot of preparation of our opponents, film breakdown, analysis of players. And I could equate, we do all this planning, we do all the scouting of the other team, we have our team completely prepared, and then we show up and our opponents aren't starting in the same formation and their lineup is completely different to how we've prepared our athletes. And that's right there, I think, your clinical moment where now how do we deal with something that we haven't prepared for? So training our athletes to be ready for the unexpected is also something that we throw into practice, is just like changing things really quickly, doing things off script, not having them know exactly what's coming next, and having to, in our situation, always having adults giving them the answers. When the whistle blows, it's like a Broadway show. I can't give them their lines.
I think, pardon the pun, but it's coming from left field, really, isn't it? These things, which is very true. And in the clinical setting every day, you start off with something that looks very different by the end of the day. But certainly, like you said, practice, which is where we're at here in, obviously, the Clinical Skills Development Service. We provide education and training in simulation. So you try and mimic as near possible what people may see on a day-to-day basis in a clinical environment, which is what you're actually doing in practice as well. We've talked quite a bit about successful teams. So if you've got lack of teamwork, how do you find that affects your outcomes?
Oh, it's awful. I work in an athletic department, so we're a team. I coach a team. I've been on teams. And for me, the one thing that I've identified as the most important thing on a successful team is trust. And if you don't have trust, I've identified that in areas that I've been involved in. If you don't trust people within your department or on your team you're playing with, or if I'm climbing and I don't trust the person who's holding the rope, lack of trust is the foundation for me of teamwork. And every single person has to know their role, and you then have to train each person in that role. And then everybody, therefore, has to trust that that person's going to do their job so that I can do my job. And so the pyramid is built. But when there's a lack of trust, either through not sharing, not communicating, not being free-flowing with information, if people feel left in the dark, backhanded deals going on, it doesn't take much for that trust to go, but it takes a lifetime to build it back up again.
So when you've been faced with those situations, how did your team or yourself address those lack of teamwork and trust? How did you address that?
Well, 2004 on Everest, we had a completely dysfunctional team. People were threatening to steal oxygen on the mountain that were part of our team, which morally and ethically just, blew my mind that I didn't want to be associated with a team that was willing to do such terrible things. And so the team completely fractured, fragmented, little groups were made out of the people who were going to continue, didn't want to continue like that. And so you kind of built alliances, almost like Survivor on television. You found people that were similar to yourself and bought into the same philosophy and just, what your personal and moral and ethical standards are and what your true north compass tells you to do. It's very obvious when it falls apart. When it's working, it's having a collective group of people that are all willing to buy into the same goal. And when I'm coaching my team, I always say there can only be one captain of the ship, and that's me. And my team is my passengers. Well, if the passengers don't agree on the destination, I'm going to have people jumping ship all the time, and I'm going to arrive in port with an empty vessel. And I can't play the game with an empty vessel. So I have to get my team, my passengers, to buy into, this is our destination. There's going to be some rough seas along the way. Are you willing to do what it's going to take to get this ship to port? And we might have to veer off course. We might have to take some side trips, but keeping everybody on board, literally, is through sharing information, being open to feedback, critical and constructive, so that the ship can be steered in the right direction. And I give those visuals to young athletes because I'm a very visual learner, and I think they can conceptualize that.
So basically, communication is the key to success here, which is the same in our clinical spaces. So I think getting the message across is really important. But if you had, say, one member of your team that was disengaged, how can you re-engage that person or give that person some encouragement to come back into the team?
Many years ago, I did a leadership course with an author here, Ken Blanchard, who wrote The 1 Minute Manager long time ago. And something that stayed with me is people don't sabotage their own projects. So skillful leaders find ways to get the team to buy into the project, and it has to be their project. A skillful leader gets the team to develop the project, even though you might have set the seed that this is what you want, but you allow people to have input, because if people have input, there's buy-in and they are much more committed to the project if it's their idea. If you work in a department where you have no input and you're just told what to do all the time, that I've seen it at work, there's much less buy-in and people are much more willing to criticize the leadership and say, see, told you it wouldn't work. And then when it doesn't, stand back and go, yep, told you it wouldn't work. So you have those sort of naysayers. If they continue to be disruptive to the team, even after, working through all of this, ultimately, for me, there's a serious conversation about whether they can remain a part of the team. I mean, that's the final, I think that's the final piece. If they cannot work to be part of the team, my question is, why are you doing this? Like, why do you want to be part of this team if you're not being a team member?
And I think ultimately that's always a real big challenge in teams when you have mixtures of teams as well. And certainly on a day-to-day basis in big hospitals, your team changes every single day. So as a leader, it's very difficult sometimes to bring those people together. But I agree, you have to set that scene and let people own what is important. I just want to backtrack a little bit about, you talked about the failed attempt in Everest in 2004. Why do you think... What are some of the reasons that whole team fell apart, and why did that fail?
Oh, I mean, very, very complicated, but it came together very quickly, the opportunity to go. And I now really understand if something is, you get invited to do something or somebody's selling something on the cheap, you get what you pay for. And I was blinded by a dream and didn't do enough investigation into my teammates and who they were. I just got caught up in, oh my God, I'm going to go to Everest. This is amazing. I really didn't do my research. I learned that lesson. Find out more about the people. Nowadays, with the internet, it's really hard because you don't know if it's true, some of the stuff that's posted. So it was basically a big group, a number of people very dysfunctional. Money was all complicated. I talked about oxygen being stolen. Upfront costs were not what they ended up being. There was like backhanded deals going on. People pushing to summit ahead of schedule, not listening to the leader. And then ultimately, because this was dispatches were being sent back to the States for publication in our local newspaper, when my friend who was the journalist was sending stuff back because he was critical of the leader. That leader then actually threatened to throw his tent off the mountain. So there was then the threat of physical harm to my friend Michael and myself because these dispatchers were telling the truth about what was going on. So fear of physical harm, extortion in money, and willing to steal oxygen. I was not willing to summit and pretend that everything was fine.
It's interesting because I think that team, you didn't really know everybody that well. So that's exactly the same as the situation, not quite the same, but how we on a day-to-day basis come together with a team. And I think this is where teamwork and working together is so important to being successful. Unfortunately, you got to go back in 2006, and I think that was a whole different dynamic. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but could you just talk a little bit about the team situation that time?
Well, there was 4 people that were on the original team went back, and I would say the 4 that went back were the good people, air quotes. And the other people, it was a much more reputable company that put the trip together. Jamie McInnes is a New Zealand outfitter living in Kathmandu, much more upfront. Again, everything was, our costs were published. The group coming in, the rest of the group I didn't know, but right from the very beginning, like day 3, people from different countries all put the food they brought on the table to share. And sharing food on an expedition, when you share food with people, and this is long time why leaders, and the G7 has just happened in Cornwall this past weekend, world leaders make huge world decisions around tables with food. And when you bring people together and you share food, you're less likely to start wars with them, fight with them, because there's a sharing of. And 2004, people hoarded food, they stole food, there wasn't enough for people to eat, and people would take before other people had arrived at camp, and so people were hungry. 2006, there was a 2-pound bag of Starbucks coffee put on the table. Coffee is such a premium there. And smoked ham from Spain. I baked a Christmas cake and brought it from here. Everybody shared. So right away there was this, wow, we're going to look out for each other feeling. And so right from the very beginning, the groundwork was set with sort of this offerings that, hey, we're all willing to give to this team.
That's amazing. Sue, can I ask if that's something that you've observed in, tea rooms? And
I'm laughing because our tea room's always got something in it, even if it's a sunken cake that some child has baked and his mum's brought it in because it's a disaster, it still gets eaten. Invariably, every shift you're on, there is something in the tea room from somebody, be it cakes or sweets or chocolates. And you're very right, it is a huge part. A night shift particularly, we tend to put the food out on the desk because it's a little bit less regimented. I think it makes the shift work better because nights at the best of time are hard work, and sharing food is a really, really important part. And I know you told me that story a while ago, Anne, and I found that fascinating because I do think you agree. You sit down and have a cup of tea and something to eat with somebody, you feel much more comfortable with that person in the environment. Yeah, very interesting. You've talked a lot about diverse teams, and obviously when you come together with groups of people that come from all different backgrounds, how do you find on a day-to-day basis the communication is effective? I know when I came to live in Australia to start with, I thought I spoke English, but in fact I found out when I started clinically that I hadn't a clue half the time what people were talking about because different words were different. We do speak different languages. So how do you find that works in your environments, either with your teams or in your outdoor pursuits? How do you find that affects teamwork?
I think, being on a mountaineering expedition, we had a lot of people from different countries. So either English was a second language for some people didn't speak English at all. I think if you're doing a common thing, that passion, you can do lots of gestures, lots of miming, lots of ways to you want to eat? have a drink. We all find ways to communicate. Oh, you also yell louder in English and think people are going to understand you too. But I think when you've got international difference, hand gestures and just being a little bit slower, or visually showing people what is it you want to do. And I've found, particularly with my coaching my team, I just talked about this last weekend when I was running a clinic. There's so many ways that people learn, and at least 3 different. You can read a book and you can read it in the book, but you're dealing with a very practical thing. I tend to write my practices on a whiteboard, so it's 2-dimensional. I can understand it because I wrote it, but then when I am explaining it to my team, actually taking people and physically putting them in place on the field and slowly walking them through maybe what a drill might look like before we do it at full speed or building on something. So written, read, and practiced. So 3 different learning styles, and it's taken me some time to realize that we all have a grasp differently of those. And so making sure when we're teaching and coaching, we're hitting all the different learning styles with the group we're working with, and understanding some of the 3D animation stuff that you're doing, and having watched one of those, that's what we deal with on the field, is being able to show something in 3 dimensions, because we're not playing a flat game. But if you explained a drill to me and told me to go do it, I'd have a really hard time spatially. But if I did it myself and just ran through it and understood, so breaking things down, doing them slowly, walking through it first, and then getting it up to real life game speed, seems to work.
It's interesting because you said it's taken a while for you to grasp that, and certainly with our foundation course, we're teaching sort of junior midwives, junior doctors, or people returning to practice, and we've taken a bit of a different approach with that, which we discuss the case, we practice what's going to happen, and then we immerse them in the simulation. And certainly with my experience of simulation, I've seen people not wanting to ever come back and do a simulation, of course, because they found it too hard, because we haven't done it at a slow enough pace for them. And from our feedback from Foundation, these juniors are finding that so good to be able to practice before they actually apply it. So it's exactly the same concept. I think we have to remember, as experienced people, we've already got that knowledge, but we had to get it from somewhere. So imparting that's really important, and in doing it at a pace that your learner can actually grasp. So we're all different. Some people grasp it quicker than others. And Mia and I have talked a lot about the whole spatial awareness, how you learn, how you develop, and how people are good at it and some people are not good at it. But with practice, people do improve. So it's really interesting. You're saying that same concept, but in a sort of sporting environment. So it just shows we can link the 2 things together.
But it's also what Anne was saying earlier, Sue, around that mental rehearsal. That's a very powerful technique that's very well explored in sports psychology, but it's not something we've done a lot of in the clinical space. But certainly if you can practice a skill, it activates the same regions in your brain. And Anne, I'm sure you're aware of this, as if you're actually doing the activity. So it's very helpful to sort of do practice runs, even mentally.
Absolutely.
Some of the really high-end rock climbers who have working on a 30-meter rock climb will rehearse mentally all the moves, and you'll see them eyes closed, actually physically going through what move comes next in a very, very rehearsed mental picture, and then they step up to the base of the rock and they climb it exactly that way that they've rehearsed it. And it's being able to develop that skill is very difficult, but to perform at that level, that's what it takes.
I think I want to just move on a little bit about leadership now, Anne, if you could just think a little bit about that, because we as clinicians often find that we move from, say, a team member and then we're suddenly a leader, and we don't get a lot of preparation for that position. So you've obviously worked in teams, you still work in teams, but you do a lot of leadership. How can you give people some advice to move into that leadership? How did you do it, and how do you advise people to transition from being a team member to a good leader?
Being prepared to fail a lot. And I have young graduate assistants that work with us, and again, it's taken me a long time because I was always very angry when I left college that nobody ever taught us how to actually teach during college, and I was angry at college for not teaching us. And then I realized nobody can teach you how to teach. You actually have to go out and do it. And then you have to be willing to analyze the things that you've done that don't work and figure out, well, then what would you do to improve? So the advice I give my young assistants when they come in is, I don't know what you're going to learn from me, but you will watch me do things and your reaction will be, I won't do it that way. Well, that's not a good way to do it. Oh, that doesn't seem smart. So my challenge to them is, before you get into the situation, is what would you do? Because none of us know. We can emulate maybe good role models that we had or people that we thought were good leaders. But I think it's very important that you have to lead within your own personality, because you can't be somebody else. So you've got to fill your basket with lots of experiences. Some will work, some won't. And it's a learning and growing. And you've got to not be afraid to fail. But also, I think when you're younger, you want to show people, I can do this. The older I am now, I'm completely comfortable with asking lots of people's input, people to share, have much more feedback from my team because I don't feel threatened. I think when you're young, you want to prove you can do it, but that's when you need the most help, but you're often the most resistant to it.
Absolutely. And interestingly, if you've been a leader for a long time, how do you find going back to being a team member, and how do you transition back to that if you have to do that? How do you do that?
Sometimes I'm like, oh, it's so nice to just be in a class with somebody else leading the class and I can just sit back. It's also very difficult sometimes being a member of a team, watching somebody who you don't respect as the leader. And I've had to learn just to bite my tongue sometimes. I think we've all spent a year and a half on 1,000 Zoom meetings that have been led by people that I'm just sitting there going, oh boy, when's this going to be over? And then other ones that have been led really well in this format, an hour can go so quickly with a skillful leader. And so I think I'm a lot more patient now and willing to just go, this might be the first time this person's done this, or I need to buy into the concept and be a good teammate. So sometimes my little devil horns come out and I'm like, yep, not doing this. And other times I'm like, no, I need to be a little bit more compassionate. This is the first time someone's doing it and I've got to help them.
So in a nutshell, what would you say are essential leadership qualities that people need that you've seen or you've experienced yourself? What would you say makes a really good leader? That's a hard question.
Be willing to admit that you don't know it all. I think when you first get put into a role of a leader, you, the individual, think you have to know everything, and it's impossible to know everything. I think when your team sees that you're willing to ask advice from others and that you're also human and vulnerable, be willing to say sorry when you're wrong, acknowledge other people's ideas might have been the right thing to do, and include as many people as you can and identify in your team the people that have expertise in different areas and find ways to acknowledge them publicly. I think just shows that you're willing to get information to make the team as good as it can be, and it's not just all you at the helm.
So can you give me an example of great leadership you've experienced during your working career or during your mountain leading, somebody or a group that you've seen lead be amazing, something you've seen?
That's so hard. I mean, we all read, a lot of the coaches, there's lots of coachy books, but in my work, there have been some good leaders. I look back on history to some of the great world leaders that we identify, Winston Churchills and the Margaret Thatchers, and, in times of great strife, what made them great leaders. People who are being willing to stand alone and make very difficult and often unpopular decisions that were for the good, in those cases, of the country. At work, we're going through a bit of transition right now. And it's been a really hard year with everything that's gone on, particularly here in the US. And I'm working right now with a national field hockey coaches board. And I would say that our interim executive director has been absolutely outstanding this year, taking over at a time where it was really hard, incredibly hard. Black Lives Matter was happening. The pandemic was happening. Our members weren't renewing their memberships because all of our sports were frozen. And just being able to navigate all of that by including as many people as possible, I would say right now, currently, that's who I think about.
Yeah, amazing. I think when we get asked what's a good leader, it's a really difficult thing to put into words. And I often spring to mind, I think of people rather than putting that into words. And I think that's exactly what you've just done. It's quite a difficult thing to say. You always think of people who you've seen as a great leader. And it all goes back to communication, which is exactly what you've just said with your National Field Hockey committee. It sounds like you kept people informed, you kept people on board, and that's been the most important part of this. So before I sort of wrap this up, I'm just going to pass over to Mia and ask her if she has anything else she'd like to ask you, Anne, before we just sort of conclude our discussion today. So Mia, anything else you'd like to ask Anne?
I have a million questions for you, Anne, but I guess we're going to have to take those offline or do a part 2, one of the two. But just before you leave, I just wondered if you feel, in your experience and drawing from your own experiences, do you think that anyone has the capability to take a leadership role, or do you think it's something that's innate characteristics that some people have and other people don't have?
And that's the $1 million question, especially on my team when the students are electing the captains. It becomes a huge debate as to who's going to become a captain, and there'll be times when my incoming class of first years, I can usually tell right away. I could tell you right now, one of my first years, by the time she's a fourth year, there's no question she will be the captain. And it's the little qualities that you notice. And for me, it's the little things that people do along the way. It's not the big things. For us, it's staying late and picking up the balls and putting them away. Things that probably in the clinical setting, it's the person that helps to do the tidying up when everybody else is gone. People who see situations beyond just themselves, and they're out of their own personal space and they're aware of others. Often those are the people that I identify, and I certainly tell my team they need to be aware that we're watching them all the time. And, the starting 11 on the weekend is not just decided the night before willy-nilly. I watch everything they do, how they interact with each other, how they treat other people. Are they treating everybody with respect, from the groundsman to the woman serving in the dining room? I think those little things, is it learnt? I think some of it, I think a lot you're born with. I think it can be trained out, and in education, that's what we're supposed to be doing with all of them. But there's still a stratification of somebody rises to the top always. Nature, nurture, not sure.
Yeah. And it just reminded me that people don't necessarily remember what you say, but how you make them feel. Yeah. And I think, it's an important take-home message as well.
And I think it's really important as a coach, and I talk about this with my assistants, that we have to model the behavior that we want them to reflect. So even in a game situation that's really very stressful, if I'm screaming and yelling at the umpire, my behavior, and then my team screaming and yelling, and then I tell them off for that behavior, I've just done exactly the thing I'm telling them off for. So trying to, in really competitively tough games, trying to show that I'm calm on the outside and freaking out on the inside. I think clinically, Sue, that's probably what you're dealing with, because when you've got a mum sitting in the bed, she doesn't want to see you having a panic attack that you don't know what's going on.
I've had people say to me, and colleagues of mine, when you've done this for a while, is how calm you appear. But I always say, if you knew what I was feeling inside, you learn to manage yourself, it takes practice. It just takes practice over time. But that was a really interesting answer, actually, because I'm sitting here smiling, thinking of all the team leaders I've worked with in my career and how they're very different personalities and not always the loudest gets to the top. Sometimes the quieter achievers make amazing leaders. It's not just about being able to speak or shout or be the loudest. It's about who you are and how you present yourself really on a day-to-day basis. So that's amazing. I think what I'm going to do is just recap a little bit on our discussion, and then I've got one more question before we finish. So just to recap what we've discussed today, what is teamwork? How teamwork affects our group dynamics, what makes a successful team, and how we move forwards after a failure or a difficult situation in teams. What was a successful team and how we managed to get that to work, how to step up and become a good leader, and what are the key leadership qualities that we see in most environments. I think just for our listeners, Anne, I was just wondering if you've got any advice of any good podcasts or readings or articles that you may think people would be interested in reading around teamwork or leadership from our discussion today. Anything you can think of?
I mean, there's so much stuff out there. I would probably have to put a list together for you rather than pulling stuff. I mean, there's a lot of books here in the States. One that kind of comes to mind just quickly with the team, it's called Catch Them Doing Something Good. And basically, it means when people are running a practice, rather than criticizing people when they're doing something wrong, you actually stop practice when somebody does something right and publicly praise. So it's the glass half full rather than glass empty kind of approach. So that's a book called Catch Them Doing Something Good. There's so many, and I'll be honest, we use it's called the Captain's Leadership Council book by Jeff Jansen, and that's got short chapters in it. A lot of this stuff I think is great. I think if you've been doing this for a long time yourself, it comes down to common sense. And you just have to kind of think about what is important to you. You can read all the books, but it doesn't make you a leader. So I think trying to find internally your own values, identifying those first rather than trying to rely on somebody else's words. And so I don't read a ton of that stuff. I read some of it, but I read it and go, well, yeah, isn't that obvious? And no, it's not always, but
I think you mentioned about the failed trip to summit of Everest in 2004, and you had Michael Kodes with you on that expedition. He did actually publish a book around that trip, didn't he? High Crimes, was that correct?
Yeah, High Crimes, the greed and fate of Everest.
Yeah, which would be one maybe people might like to read separate from this teams and leadership, just to put a perspective on what it's all about out there. And it's certainly becoming more a dog-eat-dog world by the sounds of things with Everest and how they're managing the numbers of people in that space today. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and Mia as well for joining me, who I know would like to now probably talk to you after this a lot more. It's been a great sort of exploration around teams and leadership and how we can relate that to any setting, and particularly in the clinical setting, I certainly can see how what you've been saying fits with what I do on a day-to-day basis. So thanks again, Anne, and thanks, Mia.
Pleasure. Thanks, Sue.
Okay, thank you.